What are our perceptions of the Third Reich, the country that unleashed a slaughter, claiming the lives of tens of millions? There are Wehrmacht soldiers, ideological Nazis, Gestapo officers, executioners, SS members, inhuman beings who reveled in their crimes. And then there is their leadership, which we saw in the most famous and arguably best series about World War II, 17 Moments of Spring. We see the SS leadership, the elite of the Nazi Party, portrayed as meticulous, polite, precise managers. This was in March of the year 1945, when Soviet troops stood just 70 kilometers from Berlin. These were educated, systemic thinkers, complete scoundrels, yet maximally efficient. They managed to construct such a powerful criminal state structure as the Reich, with its party, military, and repressive institutions. In 17 Moments of Spring, we see the pinnacle of this Reich. And the last thing you would consider about this pinnacle is that it represents the most inefficient state in recent history. Misheard? No, the Third Reich was indeed that inefficient state, but it didn't become this way by the spring of 1945, when Nazi Germany was already falling apart. It was like this almost from the beginning, a rotten state formation corroded by corruption, intrigue, and hatred. It wasn't even a state, rather a conglomerate, and clearly not Stark Industries, a conglomerate where numerous companies engaged in a dogfight lacking any charter or rule of law. Today's coverage could be called an investigative indictment, but the Nuremberg trials took care of that long ago. In this video, we will explain who exactly created the Third Reich and what this structure looked like from the inside. How did the Nazis deceive their voters? Who embezzled billions on preparations for World War II? How did Hitler silence dissent not only with lead but also with suitcases of money? And finally, why does Goebbels' propaganda still work today? Chapter 1. The Party of the Aggrieved. In the year 1918, the First World War, the German front is on the verge of collapse. In Germany, unexpectedly, a revolution occurs. The country becomes a republic. The new authorities sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. The young Weimar democracy is disliked by no one in Europe. From the east, revolutionaries are sent in, and the west drains the country of its resources under the guise of reparations. Within Germany itself, the far-right Nazi terror is on the rise. Then comes the financial collapse. The Great Depression begins. A loaf of bread costs 1 billion marks. The country looks like a plump Berlin donut, swollen with credits. Germany needs to repay its debts, but it can't. Mass bankruptcies occur. Throughout Europe, unemployment proves even more terrifying than inflation. Discontent raises the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. They were long political losers, but then began to explain to hungry and unemployed Germans who was to blame and what needed to be done. The old elites decided to ride the wave of the Nazis' popularity. After prolonged persuasion, the aging President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as the head of a cabinet of aristocrats, that is, the head of government, in January of the year 1933. That evening, the newspaper of the Berlin branch of the NSDAP, published by the party's propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, featured a sensational front page. Chancellor Hitler, Minister of the Interior Frick, Minister of the Interior of Prussia Goering. Just to clarify, Frick is not a characteristic. It is the surname of the main Nazi official. That's essentially all there was to boast about. The remaining posts in the cabinet were occupied by representatives of the political elite close to the president. Ostensibly, everything was going according to the plan of this elite. All the fears of the critics that Adolf would seize power proved unfounded. The upstart Hitler could shout anything he wanted to the public, theatrically clutching his hands to his chest. In reality, he was manageable and obedient. However, this was an oversimplified interpretation. In truth, Goering and Frick had the entire apparatus of coercion in their hands. The Nazis subdued the entire police force. In the event of mass protests, they had an instrument of suppression, which meant the preservation of power. Most importantly, Hitler gained the right to dissolve the parliament, the Reichstag. Consider this the removal of one of the last checks that somewhat restrained him. Adolf was irritated that at the time he came to power, there were very few Nazis in the parliament. He could dissolve the Reichstag, conduct elections again, and by controlling official propaganda primarily via radio, fill it with people obedient to him. Many thought at the time that he wouldn't dare to hold a third election in a year, but he did. Hitler dissolved the Reichstag and scheduled elections for early March. Imagine the bewildered Germans being asked for the third time to re-elect the parliament, as if to say, "Dear citizens, we understand that you have already eaten through all your shoes and moved on to the shoelaces, but please vote one more time and then life will improve." It's important to remember that by the beginning of 1933, unemployment in the country had confidently surpassed 20%. Many were fed up with political struggle. They needed to think about other matters. Perhaps to hell with these elections? Many in Germany thought so at the time, and they got what they wanted. Free elections would not be held in the country for the next 15 years. A week before the voting, a scandal occurred. Overnight, the parliament building burned down. The fire was started by a lone pyromaniac, a former communist. The Nazis seized upon this event and began to spin it as a red threat. The Reichstag fire became a massive propaganda operation. Under this pretext, the Nazis convinced the president to issue a decree, allowing the law enforcement agencies, that is, those controlled by Hitler's Ministry of the Interior, to freely violate freedom of speech, assembly and privacy. For example, the security forces obtained the right to so-called protective custody. They would round up individuals into special facilities where there was nothing to charge them with, yet they keenly desired to imprison them. This is precisely how German concentration camps emerged. In the new elections, the NSDAP received 44%. But it was still less than what Hitler desired. Together with the Conservatives in the coalition, they already had 52%. For government operations, it would suffice, but for gaining full power, not quite. Hitler understood that he could enact any law, but issuing them was a different matter. That was the sole prerogative of the president. If only there were a document that would equalize his rights with those of the president. What if a state of emergency were declared? Naturally, the president would not issue such a decree. He would not only oppose it, but he also would be physically unable to do so. Amendments to the constitution were necessary for this. Therefore, it was required that the Reichstag vote for it with an absolute majority. The Nazi and Conservative coalition alone, with 52%, was not enough. Hitler then resolved the issue radically. The Nazis simultaneously arrested the entire communist faction on fabricated charges. They then began persuading the remaining members that such a law was essential. As you can guess, they succeeded. On the 23rd of March, this document was adopted. In mass culture, this birth of the Third Reich is shrouded in myths. Take, for instance, the British telefilm The Rise of Evil. A unique biopic of Hitler, by the way, quite accurate in its details. From the Parliamentary Tribune, Hitler announced the provisions of the document. The Nazi half of the Reichstag listened intently, while the other deputies and government members sank into deep shock with every word, protesting louder and louder. The footage of the session is effectively intercut with scenes where SA stormtroopers, the combat units of the Nazis, raid the office of a liberal newspaper. But precisely in this episode, the filmmakers, of course, dramatize heavily, as otherwise it would be monotonous to watch. The most terrifying part was that Hitler's seizure of power happened mundanely and boringly. For almost a month, the Nazis engaged in negotiations and consultations, a typical political process. To the liberals, they promised the stability of the Centre Party, to recognize the Catholic Church at the state level. In the end, the emergency law was supported by 444 deputies, constituting 69% of the Reichstag members. You must be wondering, how did this come about? Did moderate politicians, experienced statesmen become so frightened, stupefied or blinded that they simply handed over all power to the radicals? What kind of vasectomy without anesthesia is this? Here one must understand who the liberals were dealing with. Not with SA stormtroopers, but with politicians just like them who sometimes wore brown uniforms. This is how we tend to imagine the average member of the Nazi Party. It is considered that they are essentially the lower middle class, indoctrinated with disdain for the communist workers below and belief in a global conspiracy and hatred for Jews above. Such a description is generally true for the rank-and-file Nazis, but the party elite, the Reichstag deputies, the leaders in the regions were altogether different. They are not a mere toast, but crouton. The essence may be the same, but the execution and perception are entirely different. In terms of social composition, the Nazi leadership was almost indistinguishable from the deputies of the liberal parties. Half belonged to the middle class, a third were elites, that is, industrialists and aristocrats. The rest, yes, from working-class families. Therefore, Democrats and centrists viewed Hitler's associates not as individuals who would immediately establish a dictatorship and line everyone up against the wall. To them, they were just fellow politicians. It was clear that they had tens of thousands of thugs on a leash. Another prevalent myth is that the Nazi leaders were not only tall but also uneducated. However, the stormtroopers, for example, often comprised people with higher education. During the crisis years, students essentially stepped out of university doors into a void. Now let's look at the makeup of the parliament. In the Nazi faction, 1 in every 3 had higher education, and every 10th held an academic degree. It's interesting to consider what kind of education they had, and in what fields. In the Nazi parliamentary faction, compared to other parties, there was significantly more representation of biologists and medical professionals. Among the security forces, such as the SS, there were more likely to be humanitarians, historians, and philosophers. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, even obtained a diploma as an agronomist. About 10 years ago, German researchers discovered that the secret police, including the Gestapo, mainly attracted poor students, outcasts from military academies. Combat officers were prohibited from pursuing that path. Even if one were to climb over others, sheer force alone could not resolve everything. Such was the regular composition of the Gestapo, but their leadership, that was the German intelligentsia. At the start of the war, Himmler created a super department within the SS, the RSA, the Reich Main Security Office. In the hypothetical pyramid of thugs, this was the apex. It included intelligence, counterintelligence, the Gestapo, and criminal investigation. It was precisely there that Stirlitz and all the other characters from the film 17 Moments of Spring, with which we began, worked. Thus, of the 300 top officials in the RSHA, 2/3 had higher education, and of those more than half had earned academic degrees, mainly lawyers, philologists, historians. These extraordinarily educated and well-read individuals were the ones who ordered the creation of death camps to cleanse Europe of Jews, Slavs, and Romani people. A butcher doesn't necessarily stand in a blood-stained apron. An interesting detail in the demographic portrait of Nazism is that teachers actively joined the party. It is understandable that once Hitler seized power, everyone wanted to be friends with the Nazis, but teachers stood out particularly. In the 1930s, there were about 400,000 educational workers of all levels in Germany, including kindergarten teachers. Compare the dynamics. In 1933, 3% of teachers were in the NSDAP. A few years later, it was 16%, and by 1937, every 4th Nazi was a teacher. Why was this? It all lay in the stereotypes and mentality of the time. Today, we are accustomed to the idea that being a teacher is an honorable profession. Yes, one may not earn huge sums of money there, but honor and respect are present. A teacher is practically another parent, working with the future, that is, with children. But in those years in Germany, there was a huge social gap between a teacher and a professor. A professor at an ancient university had respect and honor, taught the offspring of wealthy and influential parents, and moved in elite circles, whereas a school teacher was a minor official with a meager salary. During the Kaiser's time, teachers were universally reserve officers. It was some sort of compensation, a chance to hold on to their position on the social ladder. Due to this, many ordinary teachers often abandoned their profession and joined the Nazis full-time, where they could release their pent-up emotions. A striking example is Julius Streicher, a former elementary school teacher in Nuremberg. Incidentally, it is also where he was executed by the tribunal's verdict in 1946 for publishing an anti-Semitic newspaper and calling for genocide. Over time, teachers who did not join the party began to be viewed with suspicion, or worse, they were immediately dismissed. This aspect is well depicted in the German film Never Look Away. In my opinion, your father is very stylish, since he does not join the party. One signature, and he could have saved his teaching job and apartment. In conclusion, who were the Nazis, really? They were people from various social strata, quite educated. Having practiced on school children, they learned to work with an audience. Cunning and flexible opportunists, ultimately resentful of the entire world. This is a key trait of the Nazis. Self-pity in them stretched back to the 1920s, when Weimar Germany was shaken by crises. And where you feel a sharp sense of injustice towards yourself, you'll be quicker to understand that other people's happiness is also unjust. "19 months after the beginning of Germany's revival, Adolf Hitler flew to Nuremberg to meet with loyal comrades. This is the beginning of the film Triumph of the Will, about the NSDAP Congress in September the year 1934, a classic of Nazi propaganda cinema. References to the visual imagery from this film can be found everywhere when a director wants to depict absolute evil. This includes Star Wars, the final episode of Game of Thrones, and even Disney's classic The Lion King. Triumph of the Will captured, refined and formed the aesthetics of Nazism. By personal order of Hitler, 280,000 Reichsmarks were allocated for its production. For those times, it was the average budget for a feature film, but more than other documentaries. In today's terms, the budget of the film equates to $1 million. Triumph of the Will is also a personal triumph for Hitler. By the time of filming, he had resolved all his internal political concerns and transformed Germany into the Third Reich. These 1.5 years are referred to by historians as Gleichschaltung, or synchronization. The simple goal was to quickly form, or more precisely declare that you have formed, a Volksgemeinschaft, a classless national community that originated in the trenches of World War I. Let's imagine Gleichschaltung as a flowchart, or better, a focus tree, like in a well-known niche video game. The authorities make decisions, they wait a few months, gain some dividends, and then can take a new step. Hitler's rise to power unlocked a new focus tree. We already described early elections and emergency decrees. Next, consolidation of power. April of the year 1933, the dissolution of regional parliaments. Now, each province was governed only by a deputy of Hitler. May, an attack on the labour movement. After the Grand May First celebration, the trade union workers went to work. Upon arrival, they were stunned. The Nazis had sealed all the offices, shut down newspaper editorial boards, and created a single correct union, the Labour Front. In June, establishing new parties was prohibited. By July, the most radical move occurred. All parties were dissolved, except for the Nazi Party, of course. In December, the role of the NSDAP was consolidated through the law on the unity of the state and party. Consequently, it became a public legal corporation, a terrifying chimera. The party was neither governmental nor private. It operated in the interest of society as a whole, and the authorities in particular. Its sources of sustenance were also unclear. By February of 1934, the Reichsrat was abolished, the upper house of Parliament. What was the need for the Reichsrat anyway? The power was already in the right hands, and Hitler viewed federalism as harmful and dangerous. Everything was set. Hitler could sit in his luxury Mercedes, turn on Beethoven, and race down the Autobahn toward the sunset. Speaking of Autobahns, infrastructure and social programs, every time someone mentions that the Nazis managed to achieve something besides starting wars, Autobahns almost immediately come up. They were a vast network of highways that did not need yearly repairs with no speed limits. However, due to increasing accidents and a fuel shortage in the country before the war, the authorities eventually imposed a 62 miles per hour, which during the war became 49 miles per hour. This showed deception even in minor matters. Around the Reichsautobahn, as Goebbels' propaganda called them, many myths exist. The most famous is that the autobahns were made for the military. In reality, it was a network that stretched more from north to south rather than west to east, where battlefronts could and eventually did emerge. The reason was economic. Adequate logistics were needed. 10 years before the Nazis' rise to power, the private car fleet in Germany had tripled, reaching 500,000 vehicles. Another myth lies in the name Reichsautobahn. The Autobahn was not Hitler's idea at all. Hitler himself repeatedly criticized the Autobahns. The idea was brought to him by Fritz Todt, an engineer who became a Hitler accomplice. At his urging, the Nazis perpetuated another myth, that the Autobahns helped Hitler combat unemployment, like the Hoover Dam in the United States during the Great Depression. This is a half-truth. Tens of thousands of people worked on the Autobahn construction. That's a lot. But the other 5+ million were also building not just roads, but also subways, tram lines, and so on. Men and women were enlisted in a semi-voluntary compulsory manner. Regarding women, Hitler had a separate plan. The Führer decided that women should not pursue careers. Their duty was to give birth to new soldiers for the country. For instance, if young couples were getting married, they were gifted the Führer's memoirs as a valuable present. One could refuse, but it was advisable not to. And if they were true Aryans and merciless to the Reich's enemies, the newlyweds were rewarded with an act of unprecedented generosity, an interest-free loan from the state. $500 calculated in modern money over a period of 8 years. It needed to be repaid little by little every month. For each child, a quarter of the debt was cancelled. If you gave birth to 4, then effectively you were considered fully paid off. The wife was required to resign from her job as part of this arrangement. The husband, on the other hand, had to promise with his signature that he could support the family. Later, the condition regarding the wife's resignation was revoked. When all the men went to the front, women went to work in the factories. Initially, the policy worked. Over the 6 pre-war years, Germany's population increased by 3 million people. Fertility rose from less than 2 to 2.5 children per woman. But then, Hitler burned everything to ashes in the furnace of war. Over the next 6 years, 7 million Germans perished, mostly men in the prime of life. Fertility plummeted to a historic low. The demographic catastrophe was mitigated only by the influx of refugees. 12 million Germans were driven from all over Europe back to their historical homeland. What Germany went to war with, it returned with upon the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, and the German Democratic Republic, GDR, 10 years later. 69 million people. Another key social policy direction in the early years of Nazism was charity. The most famous NSDAP program was the Winter Relief, a voluntary collection of funds for the unemployed and needy. Each season, up to $180 million in our currency could be collected. As to where these sums settled was another matter entirely. When the party treasurer began to ask questions, the NSDAP leadership replied that the Führer was handling it personally. The extent to which the winter relief was voluntary can be judged by the diaries of Victor Klemperer, a man of an extraordinary fate, a philologist and lecturer, a Jew, married to a pure-blooded German woman which saved him. That, and the fact that he fought for Germany in World War I. He did not immediately lose his prestigious job and home. Later he was moved around between dormitories and ghettos, but fortunately he avoided concentration camps. His unique records have survived to us, a view from within the Nazi structure. In October 1933, when the Winter Relief Program was just being launched, Klemperer's contribution was simply deducted from his salary. In October 1933, the Nazis passed a law on civil service to oust communists and Jews from the entire budgetary sphere. Their positions were filled by tested comrades, not always qualified, but certainly loyal. In addition to the civil service, Aryanization was applied to the economy. Jews were forced to sell businesses at half price to their German partners. By the late 1930s, entire industries were simply being closed off to them. Assisting the Nazis in this effort were the very SA stormtroopers. The stormtroopers had slipped off the party's leash, engaged in racketeering, and began seizing businesses from undesirable citizens. While the parliament, judiciary and press looked the other way, disgruntled people started meting out chaotic justice. A couple of examples. In Hamburg, stormtroopers literally forged a search warrant and robbed a jewelry store owned by Jews. In Breslau, an SA officer extorted around $75,000 from a Jewish department store director, ostensibly for the benefit of the party. The majority of that sum was transferred to his wife's bank account. He did not shy away from racketeering and the mutual aid fund, which was responsible for that very winter relief. The Berlin cell deliberately recruited Jews into its ranks, then exposed them, labelled them as spies, and demanded bribes for moral damages. From Klemper's diary, it is evident that the level of madness grew each month. Desperate, he sought any signs that this nightmare would soon end. He thought that people shouted such aggressive slogans at rallies out of weakness, and on the kitchens of Germany, everyone was already admitting that they were tired of Hitler. Klemper tried to rationalize reality. He naively thought that this darkness couldn't grow thicker forever, that filth indeed ended, but not in the way it was expected. In June of 1934, the elderly President Hindenburg himself became so tired of the stormtroopers that he gave Hitler an ultimatum. Either he calms the SA or he loses his position. But then another crisis occurred. SA leader Ernst Röhm had been discussing with generals for a year that it would be beneficial for his stormtroopers to be integrated into the regular army. Each party set out its own conditions. Ultimately, Röhm annoyed the generals so much that they went to the SS leadership, which was an elite unit within the SA, and they began to plan together how to quickly deal with Röhm. Hitler couldn't decide what to do. Should he yield to the president and the army, or stick to his guns? Then SS Chief Himmler came, and he resolved the matter radically. On June 30th, SS men and stormtroopers loyal to Hitler arrested dozens of SA generals across the country. Some were killed on the spot, others in prison a few days later, like Röhm himself. During the Night of the Long Knives, the Nazis dealt with not only undesirable comrades, but also with remnants of the conservative opposition. Many politicians, including the Vice-Chancellor who was supposed to oversee Hitler, lost their positions. Several dozen were killed. Such excesses could have seriously upset President Hindenburg, but he simply didn't have the chance. The president died a month later. With yet another decree, Hitler combined the posts and concentrated all powers in himself. The process of equalization was complete. So the national revolution, which the stormtroopers talked about for so long, has been accomplished. Who benefited from it? Let's recall that the electoral base of the Nazis and the main core of the party were farmers, intelligentsia, and small and micro businesses. So they became the masters of life, right? Wrong. Hitler deceived everyone again, and by then it was dangerous to express discontent if you wanted to remain free. Farmers were promised that they would be made into the new nobility. They were told that it was the rural populace that was the source of the nation's strength, not the cities, where one couldn't even breathe due to factory smog. However, the Nazis forgot to mention that not everyone would be taken to the Bright Future station. According to the inheritance law, farmers essentially found themselves in the position of serfs. No matter what happened in the economy, you had to sit and tend your garden and then pass it on to your son. It became impossible to mortgage land for some new venture. The Nazis built the rural elite from the middle class. The independent farmer, a strong manager of his estate, had enough land to feed his entire family, but not so much that he would need to hire labourers. According to Nazi demands, plots had to be exactly medium-sized. If your plot was too large, you had to share it with someone. If it was too small, give it to another and hire yourself out to work for them. This was not the life the rural Germans envisioned when they voted for the NSDAP. Similar processes occurred in the cities. If a person ran a small shop or lacked money, they were quickly deemed inefficient. The shop was closed without any compensation. A loyal citizen took over, and the owner was forced to work as a labourer. This resulted in a paradox. Small shopkeepers voted for the Nazis supposedly to protect their jobs from malicious Jews. Ultimately, those very Nazis drove them out of their jobs. You might not imagine the scale of the problem. Nazis were obsessed with bureaucracy in all aspects. The Reich concocted so many laws, regulations, unions and chambers that even Elon Musk, with his efficiency department, would have been left wide-eyed. Large-scale corruption took root. Let's not forget the principle of Aryanization. Did you like a certain business? Then simply find a Jewish grandmother in the owner's family tree and seize it for the benefit of the party. A similar fate befell the premium porcelain brand Rosenthal. The company founder was ousted, and the business was taken over by Aryan collaborators. Instead of elegant plates, they started producing mugs and bowls, emblazoning them with their swastika. Finally, the third pillar of the Nazi electorate, civil servants in the broadest sense. Teachers, officials, and part of the intelligentsia saw little change in their status under the new regime. Some were fired, others promoted. Yet bureaucracy had no clear understanding of its own role. The further things went, the more the functions of officials were duplicated across various competing groups. Take, for instance, the Ministry of Labour. Even before the Nazis, it was headed by conservative Selter. He remained the minister under Hitler. Yet half of his functions were taken over by the Labour Front, the Reich Labour Service, and countless other proliferating structures. So, who actually held the power there? To answer this question, let's turn to Germanic Scandinavian mythology, which Nazi propagandists loved to reference and distort. The Third Reich was like a multi-headed giant, similar to the Jotuns from ancient myths, a powerful destructive glutton normalizing violence with a demonic nature all its own, but with serious coordination problems. We have already identified the first head, the state apparatus. The second head was the party, the NSDAP. The party's sphere of influence included only three areas: police, propaganda, and work with the youth. While the other heads of this behemoth were occupied with the present, the NSDAP assumed the image of the future, where the country was headed and who would lead it there. They reasoned that while all these officials, officers and businessmen played their current roles, in the future the country would be in the hands of their youth, whom they would mould as they wished. Former teachers, who we know joined the party en masse, adeptly handled the task of re-education. As for the police, when it comes to totalitarian measures, the Third Reich was unique. Nowhere else were the security forces and intelligence agencies purely party-based rather than state institutions. The middle and upper echelons of the organs were purged and replaced by Nazis, primarily from the SS. Then came the Night of the Long Knives, when the SA was effectively reduced to the status of a sports club, leaving the SS without competitors among the security forces. Yet, no German would function without order. Everything had to be formalized. In the summer of 1936, Himmler was appointed chief of the German police, and he integrated all law enforcement agencies under the SS. This included everything from traffic inspectors and border guards to Gestapo officers and the criminal police. Once again, they all were subordinate to the party, not the state. It was then that the SS was permitted to use weapons in any unclear situation. This, in part, accounts for the numerous atrocities committed by SS members in occupied countries. Party propaganda and the NSDAP warrant a separate discussion. Party leader Goebbels was responsible for policy in this domain. The ideology of Nazism presented to the Germans was a murky mix of various ideas that could contradict each other. Hegelianism, pragmatism, positivism, and various other isms were used to appear knowledgeable and smart, but it all served just one purpose: to show that the Führer was doing well, and you too would excel if you obeyed him, worked hard, and paid your dues on time. Marxism held a particular place here. The Nazis engaged in ideological plagiarism, borrowing slogans, propaganda systems, and general thought patterns from leftist parties. A substitution of concepts took place. Instead of proletarians, there were humiliated Germans. Instead of class struggle, a war against world usury. Instead of communism, a Polish mindscape. Partly because of this, some remain convinced today that Nazism is a leftist ideology, judging by its appearance. Moreover, Hitler's party was named Socialist and Workers. The flag was even red, which is a misconception. Just look again at the heads of this great glutton who could not stop. Number 3 is the most groomed and polished. This was yet another group of influence, the industrial magnates, the very families of the Krupps, Thysens and Flicks. With them, Hitler was remarkably consistent. Even before coming to power, the Nazi press attacked what was called Jewish capital. Primarily, this meant bankers who had the establishments of those very industrialists who later supported and sponsored Hitler in debt. And here, Aryanization played its timely role, which for banks meant only one thing. Former bankers were replaced by loyal individuals, steel magnates. It was not the bankers who took control of large enterprises, but the industrialists who filled the management of the banks and took charge of all financial flows. Where and how much we invest, to whom we extend credits, and under what conditions are now decided by those who supported Hitler. The Nazis themselves had little understanding of economics, and they didn't involve themselves too much in it. The key was that the sales channels were in the hands of trusted comrades. If desired, all flows, both goods and financial, could be redirected in the desired direction. Our giant had one last head left in a steel helmet: the army. The Nazi regime found it in a helpless state. Thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, the country had neither weapons nor people. Almost immediately after coming to power, Hitler began pumping resources, both material and human, into the army. The generals were immensely grateful to him for that, but they never forgave him for some harsh slaps in the face. Take, for example, the murder of the former Supreme Commander-in-Chief during the Night of the Long Knives, or the shameful dismissal of the Minister of Defense right before the war. The Reich leadership spurred the military with a whip. Occasionally they were enticed with a carrot, and there were legal nuances as well. For instance, if an SS member joined the army and committed a crime, the matter would be handled by an SS court, not a military tribunal. It might seem trivial, but for military personnel, such decisions, like allocating a special caste that nothing could be done about, meant a lot. The officers endured and bided their time. This also is rarely mentioned. But aside from the most famous assassination attempts, such as Operation Valkyrie, which was turned into a movie starring Tom Cruise, up to 50 conspiracies were being hatched against Hitler. A good third of these emerged within the officer corps. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt was just the last and most famous. In general, we ended up with an all-consuming monster, where one head didn't always understand what and why the other was doing, but kept silent since it might be useful to them in the future. Or perhaps this head simply feared getting hit over the head or causing a collapse. Hence, we have a strange paradox. Totalitarianism isn't about complete control, as commonly believed, but about anarchy and arbitrariness simmering under a lid painted with total control in red. However, all control often ends at the permissiveness of the repressive apparatus, which many confuse with the system's efficiency. Chaos, as Littlefinger said in Game of Thrones, is a ladder. Everything had to be deliberately entangled so that executors endlessly contradicted each other's orders while the serious players divided the money. Here, whoever picks up the stick becomes the corporal, the Bohemian corporal. Surely everyone has acquaintances whose lives are fascinating to follow on social media. A lot of ostentatious consumption, plenty of shots from luxury hotels in Dubai, branded bags, jewellery, cars, private planes, and yet the job is either completely unknown or the position is not significantly higher than yours. And if you don't have such acquaintances, you've undoubtedly seen a myriad of similar coaches in everything and immediately. Precisely 100 years ago, Hitler was a similar enthusiast of putting on airs. He constantly wanted to stand out from the grey crowd. In the year 1925, having barely been released from prison, he bought himself a latest model Mercedes for the equivalent of $90,000 in today's money, all to emphasize his status, to be, not to seem. Or here's another example. Right before the 1929 crisis, he acquired luxurious 8-room apartments in the center of Munich. 2 years later, it was there that his niece and concurrently lover, Geli Raubal, tragically died. Hitler's practices of inbreeding were notorious. When Adolf became the Führer, he would receive world leaders like the Italian Mussolini and the Briton Chamberlain in this apartment. In general, Hitler is an anecdotal example of a boorish lover of pomp. Unsettled childhood, failures in studies, nights spent under a bridge, but the more he succeeded in life, the more he believed. Everyone owes him, and he owes no one anything. From this, incidentally, came the famous principle of the Führership, the backbone of the entire Reich structure. Officials, magnates, the army, the party, they could all bicker and divide spheres of influence, but above them stood the leader. His word was an unwritten law, and he couldn't be called to account for his kind. Hitler mocked the written law because he wanted to. Of all things, he loathed taxes the most. By the time he came to power, he owed the budget nearly $2 million in today's terms, a sum comparable to that of the famous Al Capone. Courts in Germany sympathized with the Nazis, but even Hitler could have been sent behind bars if desired. His debts to the state were forgiven only in 1935. It was then that he received immunity from any debts. Undoubtedly, Hitler's path to power was not for plush carpets and expensive canvases, loyalty in exchange for money, and money in exchange for loyalty. This vicious circle was initiated by the steel magnate Krupp. In the spring of 1933, he suggested that his colleagues chip in and create a fund, allegedly for economic recovery, but in reality to lift the spirits of the new chancellor. Donations were initially voluntary, then became voluntarily compulsory. By the start of the war, every German enterprise was required to transfer 0.5% of the payroll fund there. In the center of Europe, feudal orders were re-established in the interest of one person, as if it were not the 20th century, but the 12th. And there was nothing that could be done about it. We remember how the NSDAP treasurer was rebuffed when he tried to understand how the Führer disposed of the money from the winter relief. A particularly outrageous case occurred in 1936. Before the Olympics in Berlin, the country released postage stamps en masse with the Führer's face. To obtain such a stamp, every German had to pay royalties to Hitler. His own face, therefore he should profit from it. In the end, they collected about 250 million modern dollars. So what were these sums spent on? Firstly, personal enrichment. At the time of his death, the Führer was a dollar billionaire. By the most conservative estimates, he embezzled 5 billion modern dollars. The main assets were cash, works of art and real estate. For instance, the construction of the famous Berghof residence in the Bavarian Alps cost Hitler at least $625 million. This was not a state residence, but a personal estate. The second source of expenses was corruption. Like a true feudal lord, Hitler bought the loyalty of those around him. In October of the year 1933, on the occasion of President Hindenburg's birthday, he modestly transferred 30 million to him. And when Hindenburg died a year later, Hitler assumed his position, salary, and the presidential fund, which he merged with his own. Sometimes unofficial payments to politicians were made from the aforementioned economic support fund, but more often it was from the so-called account number 5. This was a crucial tool of the corrupt Nazi structure. It was personally overseen by the head of the government's apparatus. Everything operated under the seal of top secret, circumventing the Ministry of Finance and the Reichstag. We will discuss in more detail how the Nazi elite profited from this account. The principle of the Führer was an ideal mechanism for negative selection. When competent people accustomed to working efficiently in such a power system flee, ineffective, incompetent, and lazy individuals, but extremely loyal, remain. They start to decay along with the leadership, trampling on anyone lower on the career ladder. This ultimately results in a system with only two functions: A, to be inefficient, and B, to self-replicate ineffective incompetence. All this racketeering by the stormtroopers from the very first months of the Nazi regime falls into the same category. The Führer's closest entourage was no exception. Some were unabashed, while others kept a low profile. For instance, Goering was a blatant show-off. He loved everything that was extravagant and flashy, accumulating jewelry and art objects from all over occupied Europe. In the year 1936, he was appointed responsible for the economy. At that time, he established the conglomerate Hermann Goering Works and began acquiring mining and metallurgical companies using budget funds. Goering's enterprise stood alongside other conglomerates and cartels, with its owner overseeing vast financial flows from which he could feed. If Goering could not pay or did not want to, he could easily seize an attractive asset. He even had his own armed group, separate from the Army, SA, SS, RSHA and NSDAP. Goering's personal henchmen would follow the Wehrmacht occupiers and quickly occupy the offices of the most lucrative companies. For example, the Skoda concern after the division of Czechoslovakia. Or in the year 1939, when millionaire Thyssen made an anti-war statement, he was swiftly pushed into exile. The socialized empire was divided between Goering and industrialist Friedrich Flick, another notorious Nazi. Other leaders of the Reich were more cunning. Flick, too, was an active participant in the Friends of the Economy Circle. This fund operated under the patronage of SS Reichsführer Himmler. He collected money from industrialists for insane occult research and human experiments. In return, as the chief enforcer, he guaranteed protection from competitors and helped seize interesting assets, and trading in people from concentration camps. The Quandt family executed this with remarkable finesse. The founder of the holding amassed his wealth by sewing uniforms for the Kaiser's army. With these funds, he acquired a battery factory known today as Varta, and from the year 1933, his fortunes improved even further. He became a key shareholder of BMW and held positions on the boards of 50 companies. Perhaps he was a talented manager or a visionary investor, but his most astute investment was marrying Magda Ritschl. After divorcing Quandt, she remarried and became Magda Goebbels, and they began to foster close family ties. This was the same old scheme of exchanging loyalty for the security of business operations. Incidentally, the Quandt family still holds a controlling stake in BMW, and his granddaughter is considered the wealthiest woman in Germany, over $20 billion according to Forbes. For Hitler's associates, corruption was a marker of feudal status. It was an unofficial competition to see who could seize the most power, assets, or influence. It was crucial for everyone to outdo each other. A regime of extreme extravagance wherever you looked. Elites within elites within elites. When Hitler came to power, he attempted to build the country like a party, that is, with vertical manual control. But he arrived on a preset stage with his own groups of influence. And while the Nazis were dividing factories among themselves, they overlooked the fact that behind their backs, a genuine pyramid was being constructed. In the 1982 film Ace of Aces, Jean-Paul Belmondo plays a French boxer, a World War I veteran. He travels to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, where he meets a Jewish boy. He helps the boy and his family relocate to Austria. Their bookstore was ransacked by the Gestapo, and the entire family could have been arrested. And here the film, strangely enough, intensifies the situation too much. In reality, during the Olympics, the Nazis halted their witch hunt. Berlin transformed into a blooming garden city. Western media wrote glowing reports. Even the president of the Olympic Committee was full of praise. The Führer himself, during those August days of 1936, compiled a secret memorandum for the senior officials of the Reich. There, he directly acknowledged that the internal and external situation warranted Germany to prepare its economy and army for a major war. He set the deadline: 4 years. Why such haste and precision? Let us recall the initial steps of the Nazis in the economy. Logistics, urban development, support for heavy industry. You deposit money into the party fund, and we provide you with military orders. But where did the money come from in a poverty-stricken country that had just emerged from a crisis? In the 10 years since hyperinflation, the Germans became wiser and instead of banknotes, started printing bonds, thereby multiplying the national debt. The author of this scheme was the head of the central bank. In 1923, it was he who helped the Weimar authorities emerge from the crisis. Hitler set the task of rearming and strengthening the army so that in future conflicts, the country would be prepared at least for defense and ideally for expanding its living space. The sponsors of the Nazis, who drooled over military contracts as much as SpongeBob and Patrick did, dreamt of the same. What did the head of the central bank do then? He created a shell company called MEFO, ostensibly a joint venture of leading metallurgical companies. This firm issued promissory notes with a 5-year government guarantee, similar to bonds. The government paid the industrialists with these notes for military orders, and for the business, it was a liquid financial instrument almost like the Reichsmark. De facto, this was a targeted state debt for the development of the military-industrial complex, but it was not indicated in any central bank records. The story of MEFO is a gigantic scheme at the state level, a money laundering operation with elements of a financial pyramid. Both then and now, such actions would normally lead to imprisonment. Initially, they were just unsecured paper. The program was shut down in 1938, when the first payments on the 5-year notes were due. By that time, MEFO promissory notes had been issued by today's standards, equivalent to $60 billion, a third of the national debt of then Germany. Meanwhile, by the late 1930s, budget expenditures exceeded revenues by 1.5 to 2 times. The German authorities' nightmare was the day when they would have to pay the debts. With an enormous budget deficit, 1930s Nazi Germany was barely making ends meet. If everyone decided to cash in the promissory notes, it would not be a default. It would be a real collapse. What can be done in such a situation? Collapse the pyramid? No, of course not. The government tried to curb expenses and increase revenues, but not through production, rather by economizing on the population. In one speech, Hitler, who no longer had to fear internal resistance, explicitly stated that there would be no wage indexation. The most they were willing to do was increase piece rate pay, meaning work 3 shifts and you'll get your triple salary. As part of the responsibility for the state plan, Goering introduced control over retail prices. Let's not forget the unfortunate Aryanization. In April 1938, all Jews were forced to conduct an inventory so that 6 months later all their property could be seized in the interest of the Reich, or more precisely, those who ran the Reich. The reason was this. In November 1938, a young Jew killed a German diplomat in Paris. Thus began the Kristallnacht, the largest pogrom in the country's history. The Nazis broke shop windows, burned synagogues, and under this noise, they did the main thing. They confiscated a good portion of Jewish businesses and imposed a hefty tax on what remained. The rioters who smashed shops and windows were a propagandistic smokescreen, while the Nazi elite quietly continued the redistribution of property. Remember how Schindler's List begins? The protagonist opens a factory with the money of Jewish businessmen because they could no longer use it themselves. What's the point? The racket of Jewish assets economizing on civil servants. Hitler did this not only due to ideological convictions, but also because Germany's economy had turned into one large pyramid scheme, amounting to hundreds of billions of contemporary dollars. The survival rule in such schemes is to postpone the culmination until the very end. But by the summer of 1939, it became clear that Germany lagged behind those with whom it intended to fight in terms of rearmament, and things were only going to get worse. If the military sector, in which the country had invested in recent years, was not unleashed, the nation would simply collapse. Thus, among other significant reasons, Hitler started the war because of the financial chaos the Nazis created in their own system. Hitler went all in, and the entire country became hostage to this decision. The Nazis had only 3 options: wait for the pyramid schemes to collapse, start a war and win, or start a war and, to the delight of everyone else, lose. After the start of World War II, the entire state apparatus concentrated on keeping this Titanic afloat, pumping out more water than was entering through breaches. In the occupied territories, Goering's men seized offices, forcibly converted businesses into German cartels. Millions of civilians and prisoners of war were driven to work in factories under slave conditions to boost production. And Reichsbank emissaries scoured occupied countries for gold reserves, not to mention the jewelry and dental crowns of those who did not return from the death camps. Moreover, the SS did not merely hand over gold crowns and rings to the Reichsbank for melting. They sold them. You heard right, the central bank paid the special services for the valuables they took from the dead. The bank then melted them down and traded them in third countries for necessary resources. In total, they managed to accumulate 400 tons of gold, about half extracted from Belgium's reserves. Today, 1 ton is worth nearly $250 million. However, we have not yet mentioned the main instrument without which the Nazis could not have seized foreign corporations and driven people into slavery: I am, of course, speaking of the German army that swept across Europe. An enormously powerful head in a steel helmet on a monstrous, uncoordinated giant. A terrifying yet very revealing story. In the summer of 1941, Army Group North was advancing through the Baltics, commanded by Field Marshal von Lieb. And there, in the suburbs of Kaunas, he witnessed SS officers dealing with local Jews. Outraged, the commander wrote a letter directly to Hitler. "Why are you killing women and children?" The response was not long in coming. Hitler's adjutant rushed to the field marshal and said, "We checked the calendar. You have an anniversary in September, right? It's coming up soon. The Führer wanted to write you a check. Let's not annoy him." Von Lieb understood the hint and fell silent. As a gift, he was handed 250,000 marks. The payment to von Lieb for silence is not a nonsense or a sign of special treatment. It is a tiny episode of the organized corruption scheme of the Third Reich. In the 7th episode of 17 Moments of Spring, Sturlitz assists his agents, Professor Pleischner and Pastor Schlag, in crossing into Switzerland. On the train from Berlin, he encounters a German general. The general nervously drinks cognac and begins to confide in his fellow traveller about the state of affairs. According to him, Hitler behaves like a neurotic and an amateur, waging war by intuition and soon dragging the entire country to the grave. The general is not afraid to discuss this with a stranger because by spring 1945, this is what every German thinks. However, when you watch this episode, you are unlikely to consider this. According to the plot, the unnamed general commands a corps on the Italian front. This is high military command. He has definitely met with the Führer personally and multiple times. The general was moving from the capital to the south, presumably to his troops, yet at the Swiss border he got off the train and disappeared in an unknown direction. This is merely speculation, but Yulian Semyonov, the author of the novel and the series script, likely did not pull this scene from thin air. These revelations about the amateurishness of Hitler might have arisen because the general probably learned that he was being removed from special rations or that his estate had been taken over by the Red Army. Otherwise, such characters would have continued to keep silent. Today we know that by the spring of 1945, more than 120 high-ranking army officials were on grey unofficial payments, which is almost 5% of all the generals, admirals and field marshals of the Reich. These were the highest ranks, the cream of the military machine, the faces making decisions. As I've already mentioned, Hitler had a not-so-secret fund and a highly secret account, known to very few. Konto 5, or simply account number 5. In the early years of the regime, it was needed for purchasing gifts for politicians, including foreign ones. And when World War II began, the successes on the front in 1939 and 1940 made the Führer's head spin. He imagined himself not just as a feudal lord, but an emperor who generously rewarded commanders. In the summer of 1940, the highest generals were hooked up to account number 5. The Wehrmacht leadership wasn't starving. Generals were receiving about $10,000 a month, and marshals even more. But now generals were transferred to double rates, field marshals to triple, pure bonuses bypassing all procedures from the leader's personal stash. Let's not forget the details, like 100 million gifts on birthdays, and all of this, as they say, duty-free. We remember Hitler's attitude towards tax collectors. As a result, over 10 years, the turnover on account number 5 grew 12-fold. It was a vicious circle. The army-occupied territory enterprises came under German business, which paid an obligatory percentage to Hitler's fund. The fund replenished account number 5, and bonuses went to the generals from the account. This was the incentive to fight and argue less with the Führer. And it's important to understand these were not bonuses for good work, but purchases of loyalty in advance, even investments in loyalty, so to speak. The further the war goes, the lower my opinion of the generals. They may possess technical knowledge and physical courage, but no civic courage, no worldview, no spiritual independence and resilience. Therefore, they are entirely dependent on the goodwill of a person like Hitler. These are the words of diplomat Ulrich von Hassel. An entry in his diary is dated in the spring of 1943. A year and a half later, he was executed for participating in a plot against Hitler. Speaking of the plot, although Hitler became the richest man in Europe, he remained petty and vindictive. After the failed assassination attempt, he naturally executed all the generals who were involved in the conspiracy. He then demanded that the families of the conspirators return the corruption money he had previously sent them. But let's go back to the summer of 1940, when the leadership of the Third Reich was reveling in military triumph. The Nazis had captured France, Poland, and the entire Benelux. However, this did not at all solve the economic pyramid scheme problem. The country's debts were growing, and the military industry simply could not expand quickly enough. Time was working against Germany. Hitler needed not only a submissive home front but also resources. The Reich was still monstrously short of money, raw materials, and people, preferably slaves. This became one of the reasons for the attack on the USSR. From the very first months of the Great Patriotic War, it was clear that something was evidently going wrong. In the summer of 1941, the deficit of steel for the German military industry reached 12 million tons. This amount was produced in the country in half a year. By December, the Germans were frozen near Moscow and suffered their significant defeat. They simultaneously declared war on the United States. This marked the beginning of the end. From then on, all Hitler could do was delay the inevitable collapse at the cost of millions of lives. The salvation of the country during those years was handled by the Minister of Armaments Fritz Todt, the same Todt who advised Hitler to build autobahns. Before the war, he directed the construction of the Siegfried Line along the entire western border. Over several years, 1.5 trillion budgetary funds were poured into it. There is no exact data on how much of this was embezzled by Todt and the cement magnates, but the much-vaunted fortified region was overcome in just a few months at the end of 1944. Todt did not have time to complete the plan to save Germany. In February 1942, he conveniently died in a plane crash. His successor was the architect Albert Speer, who was only 36 years old. Speer's greatest asset was the boundless trust of the Führer, and initially he justified it. What needs to be understood about this character? Speer was an excellent micromanager. Nowadays, such managers are also called crisis managers. This is an extensive, expensive, and utterly pointless line of fortifications that the Allies broke through in a matter of weeks. Speer continued to build this wall, but by the time of the Normandy landings in 1944, it was at best only half finished. In the administrative structure of the Third Reich, there was that same negative selection, which we have already mentioned. By the end of the war, the top managers of Germany were only the most loyal, but far from the most capable managers. Incidentally, it is among others Speer whom the world should be grateful to for the fact that the Nazis never developed an atomic bomb. This somewhat differs from what Nolan portrayed in Oppenheimer, because Speer believed that military returns were needed here and now. Therefore, when he heard from physicists in the year 1942 that some kind of atomic bomb could be made only by the year 1944 or even 1945, he did not take long to decide. Well, Germany didn't need such an expensive folly, and he did not provide funds or privileges to the nuclear scientists. Instead, there was Wunderwaffe, which could be quickly refined and put into production. That was something to work with. This included the V-2 rockets and the world's first jet-powered aircraft. And thank heavens that history ultimately unfolded this way and not otherwise. In terms of PR, Speer learned from his senior comrade Goebbels. He called his concept around the arms program a weapon miracle. This motif was eagerly picked up by the Minister of Propaganda himself. After all, there was nothing else to boast about. However, by spring 1943, Speer's system took a heavy blow. Allied bombings buried the Ruhr factories, the raw material backbone of the Reich's economy. And that summer, a substantial part of the products of Speer and his colleagues was destroyed by the Red Army at the Battle of Kursk. Incidentally, one of the proponents of Blitzkrieg, Armoured General Guderian, was then begging the Führer not to launch the offensive at Kursk. But he did so very carefully and gently. After all, he too feared losing his allowance and his new estate in western Poland. Only at the beginning of the year 1945, when the Soviet army had already entered Poland and seized his estate, did Guderian finally dare to express to Hitler everything he thought about his strategic genius. This led to the Führer ultimately removing him from the position of Chief of the General Staff. The pyramid was shrinking before everyone's eyes, but its investors were assured that they needed to endure it a little longer. Otherwise, the Red Army would come and punish them all. But if the Reich won, German business awaited unprecedented prosperity. This was exactly what Hitler said in June 1944, when everyone already understood how the war would end. The Wehrmacht was retreating, having already abandoned Donetsk coal, Krivoy Rog ore, Romanian oil, and later even from the concentration camps, their main source of free slave labor. In 1944, the Reich's military expenditures amounted to 500 billion in today's currency, comparable to all annual budget revenues before the war. Where, then, to get the money from? All central banks had already been looted. Gold removed from corpses had already been melted down. There was no way out. It was necessary to take money from the population again in the form of loans, but it was all to no avail. Soon it became apparent that the pyramid was about to collapse, but there was no one left to worry about it. The Führer was gone on the 30th of April 1945. He succumbed to a lead allergy, and the fear that what happened to Benito Mussolini and his lover in Italy would happen to him and Eva Braun. On the same day, Allied forces drove the Germans out of Munich, his second homeland. A group of soldiers broke into those very luxurious apartments of Adolf, for which he took money from party contributions. Along with them, the legendary Lee Miller, a photojournalist for Vogue magazine, snuck in. There she took $1 million selfie, a simple American woman bathing in the tub of a war criminal and billionaire. Just a day before, Miller had documented the liberation of Dachau concentration camp and witnessed firsthand the retribution of American forces against the captured SS guards. It is precisely this dark episode that haunted DiCaprio's character in Shutter Island. It was all over. The chief of propaganda, Goebbels, the Führer's successor, followed suit. A week later, the capitulation was signed. On the morning of May 23rd, the remnants of the German government, including Speer, boarded the cruise liner Patria. There they were awaited by the Allied Commission. Once on shore, these officials were already prisoners of war. This liner, Patria, was later transferred to the Soviet Union as reparations. There, it was renamed to Russia. For another 40 years, the ship, where the surviving Nazi leadership was arrested, ferried Soviet tourists across the Black Sea. Do you know why we added this detail to the script of this episode? Just look at this scene from the Diamond Arm. The Mikhail Svetlov is actually the same ship, Russia. That is, Patria, where Speer, Donitz and Jodl were arrested. Thus, the echoes of war caught up with Nikolin's character, not only in the form of a weapon presented to him for self-defense. Semyon Semyonovich could have lived in the cabin where the history of the Third Reich ended.